Defcon 5 was the first game that I bought for my original PlayStation. I got my PlayStation in 1996, and until I bought this game, all I had to play was the Volume 3 PlayStation Underground demo disc that came with the console. That was a great demo disc and all, but of course I needed some full games to play for the system. But being a 12-year-old kid at the time, I didn't have a whole lot of money to spend on new games. So I went to this local store called the Video Game Exchange where they bought and sold used games. I checked through the PlayStation games and I came across Defcon 5. First-person shooters were still pretty new to me at the time, and I was excited to have a console that could run a game that looked and played like Doom. On top of that, I was a pretty big science fiction fan, so overall Defcon 5 really appealed to my younger self. I took the game home and put it in my PlayStation, and right off the bat I was impressed with the full motion video, which was a pretty big deal at the time. Unfortunately, after about an hour or so of playing the game, I started to get pretty frustrated with it, and I decided I didn't like it all that much. I quickly came to the conclusion that it was one of the worst games I had ever played, and I didn't play it a whole lot more after that. Years later, looking back at the game as an adult, I realized it wasn't really one of the worst games I had ever played. It actually had some pretty good ideas that unfortunately weren't executed all that well, and it was held back by some significant flaws. The game was developed by a London-based studio called Millennium Interactive, who was later bought by Sony and became Studio Cambridge. It had a multitude of different publishers throughout different regions and different platforms, which you can see on this little infographic I've created here. The US PlayStation version was published by Data East. So the game is called Defcon 5 with the subtitle Peace Has a Price. And for those of you who don't know, Defcon is the Defense Readiness Condition used by the US Air Force. And Defcon 5 actually means peacetime. This ties into the story of the game because you work for a corporation that builds defense facilities that are meant to defend against alien attacks. However, no alien attack has ever occurred because no aliens have ever been encountered in space. Thus, the situation is peaceful. Of course, it wouldn't be much of a game if there wasn't some kind of conflict. Therefore, shortly after you arrive at the facility where you're supposed to update the computer software, the facility comes under attack. So, getting into the gameplay, the biggest problem with Defcon 5 is the fact that right from the start, you're completely on your own. The game doesn't really explain to you anything about what you're supposed to do or where you're supposed to go. You're just left to figure it all out on your own. And there's a lot of stuff to figure out in this game. Like I mentioned before, your job here is to update the computer systems, and these systems are pretty complex. You can use them to adjust all sorts of things throughout the facility. For example, you can adjust the parameters of the self-defense turrets. You can also use them to activate combat droids to defend the inside of the facility, or activate salvage droids to collect useful items from the surface of the planet. Another thing you can do is lock and unlock the doors to all the various rooms inside of the facility. Obviously, once the facility starts to come under attack, you're going to want to use these systems to help defend against them. The automated defense turrets can be used to shoot down the enemy ships before they can get inside the facility, but you can also take manual control of these turrets, which is oftentimes more effective. If the enemy ships get past these turrets, then the enemies will get inside and things become more tricky. This is where the game actually subverts the typical first-person shooter gameplay, as it punishes you for killing the enemies within the facility. The way it does this is that whenever you destroy one of these enemies, it actually depletes the oxygen supply in that area. So if you kill too many enemies within one area, you will suffocate and die. That makes it very important for you to utilize the facility's defense turrets. But if the enemies do get inside, the best way to deal with them is by trapping them in the various rooms using the computer system. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, literally none of this is explained to you when you start the game. You just have to find it all out on your own. Now, once you access the computer systems, you will find some of this information there. However, when you first start the game, you have no idea where to go to access the computers. And since this facility is kind of a giant maze, it might take you a while to find out where you're supposed to go. You'll travel around from one area to another using a train system, and the first place you're going to want to go is administration. But there are some areas that serve pretty much no purpose other than for you to get lost in. Now, you might have noticed that the enemies that attack you actually aren't aliens. In fact, they're robots. And this is where I'm going to get into spoiler territory for the story of the game. You'll come to realize that the corporation that you work for orchestrated this false flag attack in order to justify a larger budget for their defense operations. The guy they originally hired to do this job was supposed to go along with the whole plan, but unfortunately for them he died in a shuttle accident, and now the job has been given to you. This sets the game up to have multiple endings depending on what you do or do not discover throughout the course of the game. So that basically covers Defcon 5 in a nutshell. And now I want to go over why I decided to talk about this game. So, as some of you may or may not already know, I'm actually an independent game developer, and my most recent game, K37-D, takes a lot of inspiration from Defcon 5. Now, you might wonder, rightfully so, why would I model my game after another game that obviously isn't all that good? And a big part of the reason is because I wanted to take some of the things that I liked about Defcon 5 and try to improve upon them. In addition to that, I also thought that recreating a lot of the mechanics found in Defcon 5 would be a good way to show my range of skills on my portfolio. So with that in mind, I created my game, K37-D, with a very similar premise. I decided to make this video to go over some of the similarities and differences between the two games, and to talk about my experiences with developing K37-D. The first major similarity you'll notice is that my game is also a science fiction game set in the future. You play as an engineer named Matthew Wesson, who's been sent to a planet called K37-D, which is a real planet by the way. Anyways, a company called Dynacorp has just acquired a facility on this planet, and they've hired Matthew to go and get the systems up and running. And just like in Defcon 5, what starts out as a simple job soon turns into a fight for your life, as the facility is attacked by mutant creatures. Now, one of the gameplay mechanics that I found most interesting from Defcon 5 was the fact that whenever you kill an enemy, it depletes the oxygen in the area around you. So, in similar fashion, for my game, whenever you kill one of the mutant creatures inside of the facility, they release poisonous gas. In Defcon 5, when the oxygen gets depleted in an area, it returns over time gradually. In K37-D, if an area fills up with too much toxic gas, you have to divert power to the environmental systems to clean the air. This is of course one of the differences between the two games. Another similarity is the fact that my game also has computer systems that you must learn to work with. However, in my game, I tried to make the computer systems a little bit easier to understand and less complex. And also, they serve a lot of different functions than they do in Defcon 5. For example, in K37-D, you have to manage a limited amount of power among all of the different systems in the facility. Another difference is that my game has crafting elements to it as well. Another similarity between the two games is the fact that they both have automated defense systems. But in K37-D, you can't take manual control of the turrets. Instead of having manually controlled turrets, I had the idea to add a tank to the game. This would serve the dual purpose of giving you a more effective way to defend against incoming attacks, while also giving you a way to travel between different areas in the facility. So when the mutant creatures are getting ready to attack, your AI assistant, Aleska, will give you a 30-second warning. This should give you enough time to run to the tank and defend against the attack before the creatures can get inside the facility. And speaking of your AI assistant, that is one of the biggest differences between my game and Defcon 5. As I mentioned before, perhaps the biggest problem with Defcon 5 was the fact that it didn't give you any guidance whatsoever. So I created Aleska as a guide for the player so that they would have some idea of what they're supposed to do. Now, I definitely don't like it when games hold your hand all the way through, so there's still a lot in the game that you have to figure out for yourself. But at least Aleska is there to give you some guidance so you can figure out what direction to go in. And to help with this, I also added a mini-map in the bottom left of the screen. One more similarity between the two games is the fact that my game also has multiple endings. K37-D actually has 9 different endings depending on what you do or don't do during your playthrough. So that pretty much covers the main similarities and differences between the two games. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about how I developed K37-D. So first of all, some of you might be able to tell that I made the game in Unity 3D, which is the development software that I have the most experience with. I made this game entirely on my own, from the game design to the programming to the art and the music and sound effects. It took me about 1 year to make this game. I did the 3D modeling in Blender 3D because it's a free software and I love stuff that's free. And likewise, I made all the textures using GIMP, which is also free. You might notice that all of the textures have bump maps or normal maps on them. And that's not very common for the pixel style art that I went with. This actually presented me with one of my biggest artistic challenges in development. Whereas ordinarily you could bake them right into the 3D model or have GIMP automatically generate them for you. Instead, I had to draw every normal map by hand and sit there and think about how the light would reflect off of every corner. It was very time consuming and I kinda wish I hadn't done it in retrospect, but I think visually the end result looks pretty good. Another big challenge was designing all of the computer systems and all of the crafting components that you can make with them. Of course, I had to plan out all the different items that you would need to repair everything in the facility and all of the resources that would be required to make those items. Certain parts of the computer systems themselves were actually pretty difficult for me to program as well. My degree is in game design, not programming, and I don't really like programming all that much, but I do it because I'm the only person who's working on the game. In particular, the environmental systems and the automated defense systems were very difficult to program correctly, and to be honest, there could still be a few bugs in there. Another part of the programming that was more tedious than anything was keeping track of all the different files in the game and where and when to load them. There are computers all throughout the entire facility, and almost all of them have at least one or more unique file on them. From a narrative aspect, the biggest challenge for me was creating all 9 of the different endings and figuring out what actions would lead to each of them. I had to spend a lot of time storyboarding and mapping them all out on paper. For the music, it was actually pretty easy. I took a lot of inspiration from Defcon 5's music, but I also took a lot of inspiration from John Carpenter. I went back and listened to the Halloween 3 soundtrack a lot actually while I was composing the music for this game. Probably the biggest challenge that I didn't really think about that much ahead of time was marketing and getting attention for the game. I had created a Twitter account and I was posting almost every Saturday for the hashtag ScreenshotSaturday, but that definitely wasn't enough to get me the level of attention that I was hoping to achieve. Once the game was released and I started getting some feedback from players, a lot of it was exactly what I expected it to be. The same kind of complaints that I had about Defcon 5 is what I was hearing from players of K37-D. And while I definitely tried my best to improve on the shortcomings of Defcon 5, I totally expected to get the same kind of feedback for K37-D. K37-D is certainly a quirky game for a particular type of gamer, and I didn't really expect it to find a mass audience. Again, part of the reason I made this game was to have something on my portfolio to show off my diverse range of skills. That being said, I was very happy to see that a handful of players had really understood what I was going for with K37-D. In fact, recently somebody left a review on my Steam page and they immediately pointed out the similarities to Defcon 5, which I thought was pretty cool. To be honest, I didn't think anybody even still remembered Defcon 5, so I was really surprised to see that. And one other minor similarity I want to point out between the two games is the fact that if you go to the GameFAQs page for Defcon 5, the only walkthrough there is actually written by one of the developers. And if you go to the GameFAQs page for K37-D, the only walkthrough there is written by me, the sole developer. So if you decide to play my game and you need some help, you can go ahead and check GameFAQs for the guide. If you do decide to play K37-D, or if you played it already, first off, I'd have to give you a huge thank you. It means a lot to me if you decide to play a game that I made. And second, I would love to hear what you think about it in the comments below. And likewise, if you've watched this video all the way to the end, I gotta give you a thank you for that too. And don't forget, you can find K37-D on Steam. And if you liked this video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the thumbs up button. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content.